Hello, everyone. This is Dennis Stearns. Welcome to another Interesting People in Interesting Times chat. And there are so many interesting things going on these days. We are actually going to try to talk about something we've talked about before in trends newsletters and written chats, and that is the effect of anxiety on our brains and how that can influence things from investing mistakes, which we've seen a few here lately that our clients were on the verge of making, or it can be life mistakes, or it can just be general anxiety. And that is actually going to be the theme for the frequently asked question for the written chat coming out over this weekend. Is we've had a number of people say, I don't know why, it may be the pandemic fatigue, it may be the contentious political environment, arguments with friends over politics or family, or just a whole litany of things, but I'm feeling more anxious than normal. Well, it turns out that your brain does funny things with that. And so we are joined today by a long time, as you could say, as entire adult studying the human brain and the odd things that can come out of it. Dr. Gary Bradt. Hey, Gary. And as all of you know, Gary is our esteemed expert. Actually, has been voted top 5 in the world experts on dealing with change. And boy, howdy, we got a lot of it going on. So we are happy to have you here today and talk about the brain. So let's take a little walk back in time to the saber-toothed tiger era. Now, we're not going to go back that many years, but some of you may remember that the TEDx talk on the future of jobs that I did back in 2016, I featured the saber-toothed tiger. Why? Because our brains have been wired from that point forward to react to threats like the saber-toothed tiger, but our brains, unfortunately, are not well tuned to figuring out how big the threat is. And so a 1% threat, if you don't have any of the risk factors for COVID, a 1% threat of dying, or even less after they've done a better job at some of the things that they do if you get COVID in the hospitals and so forth. That 1% threat is perceived by the brain as pretty much the same as what you see here on the slide. So the saber-toothed tiger in a pandemic, once you get in front of that saber-toothed tiger, whatever the threat is, it releases a lot of harmful chemicals into your body. Cortisol happens to be one of the ones that creates a lot of problems, but there's issues all over the place in terms of the chemicals it releases into your body. And just imagine, if you will, that saber-toothed tiger of COVID-19 is sitting outside your cave, not just for a few hours, but every day for weeks and weeks and months and months. What is that doing to our brains? Well, guess what? This is a real-time experiment. We know what happens in prolonged war experiences. We know what happened in London in World War II under prolonged wolf at the door kinds of threats and anxiety. But there's something different going on this time. And the researchers have been picking up on that something different. And so we're going to talk about that fear, the cortisol, the adrenaline shots that hits to our body. And again, if it's happening every single day, what that can do to us. We're going to talk about some of the pleasure areas. And we're also going to talk about how these can influence decision-making, possibly most important, how we can mitigate the risk. What are the kinds of things we can do to lower the risk? It's not enough to just say, relax. Maybe that's part of it. But there's a lot of other things that we really need to do on a regular basis to get ourselves through this pandemic fatigue and however long this pandemic in various forms is going to last.
And Dennis, if I might just jump in 1 second to just kind of add to that, The cortisol actually is not bad for us. It gets us ready to fight that tiger. The problem is our brains are also designed for that cortisol and adrenaline to flush out of our system so we can go back at normal blood pressure. So the situation you're talking about, Dennis, our bodies never have a chance to flush that cortisol out. So it's the building up of the cortisol. That's what really causes all the problems.
Yeah, very good point. So the old fight or flight syndrome, it's one thing, we want that rush into our body to deal with a potential traffic accident or, some other things, and be able to react faster. Um, but it's harmful if that's flushing into our body every single day. So let's go to the next slide. And so too much cortisol. Here are just a few of the things that our physician friends tell us are issues with too much cortisol floating through your body. And these are some of the things that some of our clients and many of our friends are saying they're having issues with today. Now, the note down at the bottom, a little hard to read, says that there's also some medical conditions that can flood your body with too much cortisol. And so, again, if you're having some of these things, don't just assume it's pandemic related. It may be related to something else. And one of our prescriptions is it's an excellent time to go do a checkup with your doctor, to be able to take some blood work and, kind of figure out where you are. So next slide. All right. So Gary, I got to tell you,
Yeah.
I love Oreo cookies. I have to stay away from them or I'd be 300 pounds. But why is it that our brains weren't made for Oreos?
Mean like this, Dennis?
Oh, you're tempting me. Yes, like that one.
Right. See, when I put this Oreo up, what's going on in your brain is probably the same thing that's going on in my brain. And for you folks out there that like Oreos, or if you don't like Oreos, think of chocolate chip or your favorite ice cream. Because I'm going to pick it up from here and talk a little bit more about how our brain operates, give you some of the latest thought in the literature on how our brain operates, with the caveat, we are just barely learning anything at this point. There's so much more to learn about the brain. So everything I'm going to share with you today is their hypotheses, their working models. They will continue to evolve over time. So let's go back to our Oreo. So Dennis, what do you think is going on in your brain when you see this Oreo? You're going, ooh, you're tempting me. That's because in our brain, in about the middle part of our brain, we got something called the nucleus accumbens, which is just a part of your brain that deals with pleasure. And it's part of our motivation network. And so when you see this, your nuclear accumbens is firing. And when that sucker fires, it releases dopamine. And dopamine gives us a rush of pleasure. And we want to eat this cookie. Now, here's one of the first interesting things, folks, about how our brains work. Me and Dennis anticipating eating this cookie, research would indicate that we have more pleasure thinking about it than when we actually eat it. Now, I did get a little trouble, Dennis, at lunch today with my wife, Peggy. I was explaining this concept I was going to share. So she goes, you mean when you eat my cheesecake, you're not going to like it as much as you are just now thinking about it? Oh, no, honey, I'll love your cheesecake. So, but anyhow, so we have this cookie. Now, if you want to understand why the brain does what it does, think about it like this. Everything your brain is wired to do is designed to do one thing: propagate the species. Okay? So, how would an Oreo propagate the species? Well, it doesn't. But sugar does, because our brains got wired early on to get pleasure out of a sweet taste. Why? Well, because way back when we were chasing that saber-toothed tiger and we needed to eat, we would eat whatever we're going to eat, but we also, fruit would be good for us. And so fruit's a little bit sweet, a lot of it. And so our brains would eat that fruit, get a little bit of sweetness, we get a little shot of dopamine, we'd eat more fruit, good to keep us alive, propagate the species. That's what our brains were made for. Now, fast forward to today. Our brains weren't wired for Oreos because this is artificial sugar. I don't need this sugar to stay alive. Matter of fact, you could argue if I eat this, it's gonna be even worse for me than if I didn't eat it. Yet my brain, just like you were saying earlier, Dennis, my brain can't distinguish between the desire for this Oreo and our earlier desire for fruit. Matter of fact, this one's probably releasing a lot more dopamine in my brain right now. So I'm motivated to eat it. Now, Dennis, I'll make it even tougher on you. How about if I bring in another kind of Oreo? Now you get to choose between which one. So that's how motivation works. Let's go to the next slide if we could, because I want to begin to describe to you a little bit more now how the brain is working. Now, Dennis, I got another question for you. And those of you sitting out there, but Dennis, I'm talking to you. When you look at that, what I got up there on my slide there, Dennis, what sort of jumps out at you? What do you notice?
Well, let's see. I note the green bar with all the red bars. I note the tan circle versus the blue circle. And this is probably part of the trick. The one that stands out on the left, that's a different color.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a little harder to see those T's, but you just demonstrated some very sophisticated stuff about how our brains work. And on our next slide, I'm going to show you what this slide is all about. So turns out the most recent research would indicate that our brain operates on at least 3 fundamental networks. Now, when I came to graduate school, the research was, we'd study this part of the brain, well, the temporal lobes do this, and the parietal lobe does this, and we look at each individual area and its function. The research now over the last 10, 15 years has really been moving towards how do all of these areas connect with one another and work with one another. So there's 3 networks, and Dennis, you just did a beautiful job of demonstrating for us the salience network. Salience basically means something that stands out, something that pops out, and or something that's important to pay attention to. How long, Dennis, when you looked at that slide, did it take for you to see the green bar?
Instantly.
Almost instantly. The same thing for the other one. The T's were a little bit harder because they were so small. But that's your brain salience network. It's various parts of your brain that are wired together. Your salience network is constantly 24/7 monitoring all of your sensory intake. So we just did an intake outside, the visual intake, you're scanning that visual field. The salience network automatically picked out the thing that kind of pops out. Now, when that thing popped out, it didn't really motivate you like my Oreo though, did it, Dennis? When you saw it, you didn't go, I don't really need to do anything. Because the salience network sent a message to the central executive network. And the central executive network is the higher part of our brain. It's the part that's evolved most recently, the cerebral cortex. And the central executive network includes that plus some other parts of the brain. But you got up there, your brain said, hey, is this something I really need to pay attention to? No, it's just a green bar. It doesn't really mean anything. But if it was a saber-toothed tiger that you had noticed amongst all that other sort of stuff, your brain, matter of fact, you wouldn't even have to, your brain would have already been automatically getting you running away or fighting that tiger. So we have the salience network. By the way, it also is constantly monitoring what's going on inside your body. So let's say you're sitting there and you're working at your desk and you're just kind of, then your mind begins to kind of wander. And then you're thinking, I wonder what I'll do for lunch today. I could have a tuna fish sandwich. I had that yesterday. Oh, gosh, I asked Peggy to get the tuna fish. I don't know if she did get the tuna. That's your default mode network kicking in. The default mode network is the part of your brain that is operating when you're not thinking about anything in particular. And guess what? Our brains are in the default mode network probably most of the time that we're awake. It's a very interesting network. It's very egocentric in that when I'm in my default mode network, I'm having an internal dialogue mostly about my life. And some of you right now are having an internal dialogue about your life. And you're going, well, I'm listening to Gary right now, but I think maybe I'll go get a beer. I don't know. That's a little early for a beer. That's the default mode network. It just kind of goes all over the place. The salience network, though, if it says, hey, something just popped up, you need to pay attention to it. Tiger popped up, central executive network goes, okay, yeah, we got to do something about that. But if the salience network says, hey, central executive network, take a look at these dots here. We need to do anything about that? No, I can see, this is my higher level thinking. This is my logic, this is my planning, this is my strategy. So the salience network kind of operates between the default mode and the executive network. We're in that default mode, our mind's kind of wandering, we're kind of daydreaming. We also time travel when we're in that. We begin to think about the future. What will I have for dinner tonight? I wonder if we can go on our vacation. And then maybe you go in the past, oh, I can't believe that meeting I had earlier today. God, I got so mad about Sarah. She just, oh, I don't know why she said that. And that's how our brains operate without us even trying. Salience network, though, sees something important. It says, hey, default node, shut down, central executive, pay attention. All right, let's go to the next slide. So let's go back now, tying it into the motivation Dennis and I were talking about earlier. Again, in the middle part of our brain, propagate the species. One of the ways we do that is pursue pleasure. And in the early years when we were forming, that meant going out and finding food that we like so that we would eat that food. Sexual relations are one of the strongest, if not the strongest pleasures we have, because that's the thing that will really guarantee we propagate the species. And again, our brains weren't designed to give us pleasure from pizza and from Oreos or from putting a big gamble on stocks. Because for some of us, when we are placing a big gamble on a stock, for those of you who kind of like to take those chances, you get a huge rush of adrenaline anticipating all the pleasure you're going to have when you buy that stock and you make $1 million zillion and you can buy that new house. And when you actually buy the stock, usually that kind of goes away pretty quickly. And then maybe the fear kicks in. So we're motivated to find that pleasure. We're also motivated to avoid pain, obviously. We don't want to, and that keeps us alive too, because if we discover that we touch something sharp and that really hurts, okay, we won't do that. We're a little bit safer. Now, in the next slide, you're going to see how the executive network interacts with our motivation.
Yeah, and Gary, before you go on, I was going to mention that I just recently read that the rise of what's called Robinhood, which is a way for smaller retail investors to buy very small amounts of a particular stock or something else, that some of the behaviors they're seeing on that network are because people can't go to Atlantic City or Las Vegas, or it's an outrush of gambling where they're getting that shot of dopamine. Well, they can't get it the same way now,
right?
And so they're using the stock market and as a substitute. And I've heard that research before, but I thought it was interesting that one of our more modern day things is probably exploding on the upside use as a result of that.
Yeah, particularly people who couldn't bet on sports because all the sports went away. So I bet on all these sports, and that's kind of how I got my pleasure. And then that went away. So hey, I'll go over and start gambling in the stock market. Now, this is kind of interesting, though. Let's take it one step further. If your salience network, some of our salience networks are set a little too sensitive. And when we spot something, it automatically triggers fear. It's almost like if you had a defense system, a radar system set up in case missiles were coming in, and you got your salience network set up that if a butterfly flies in, you get scared. Now, I don't know, Dennis, but it may be that people have super sensitive salience networks that way and kind of overplay the threat, as you were talking about earlier. I don't know, maybe those of us that have that, we're more risk averse when it comes to our portfolios. You could answer me, that's a hypothesis, I don't know. Now, others of us could have a salience network that underplays the threat. It's just a tiger. He's probably won't bother me. And that's kind of a dangerous way to go. And so we might be a little bit more aggressive and take a little bit more risk. That's why we have the executive network. The executive network is there to try to override those motivations that we feel. So I go back to my Oreo. Should I eat this or not? Oh man, I really want to because it tastes really good. But my executive network, yeah, I know, but I've been gaining weight lately and I don't want to gain any more weight. And I said I was going to lose weight during this pandemic, but man, that thing looks really good. Now we got some stress going in the system. Now we're trying to figure out what we ought to do. And one of my hypotheses is that motivation network and the pleasure and pain, that's been around a lot longer than our cerebral cortex. And our cerebral cortex, I was reading Dennis's book, the book Dennis is recommending for us all, the Your Money in Your Brain by Jason Zweig, and he's got all kinds of wonderful ideas on how to manage your brain and your emotions so you don't make some of those mistakes. But as I was looking at all of his stuff, and they're good stuff, there's no dopamine in that. Most of them are kind of logical, rational, tied in with your executive network. So therefore, we got to kind of give our executive network a boost. We got to find the dopamine somehow for the executive network. And there's lots of different ways we could do that. I won't go into those now because I don't want to take up too much time. Let's go to the next slide, please. Dennis.
Yeah, so I think this leads into one of those risk mitigating techniques, which, as it would happen, the Navy SEALs are using this technique. Fortune 500 CEOs are using this technique. And so drum roll, please. Next slide. So Gary, tell us about mindfulness and meditation.
Mindfulness and meditation have a bad rap with a lot of people, particularly some of us older folks who've been around. And as soon as we see the words mindfulness and meditation, we start picturing people in robes sitting around going, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Mindfulness and meditation is one of the most powerful tools we have to boost that executive network. Because what mindfulness along with meditation, there's all kinds of different kind of meditation. Right now I'm talking about mindfulness meditation. Well, what does mindfulness really mean? Mindfulness means you are aware of what's going on in your body and in your mind and in your emotions, but you're not attached to them. You notice them. It's giving a boost to the executive network. It's almost as if you could step back and I can see myself holding this Oreo and I can see how much I really want to eat it. But I stay calm because I've trained my mind to stay calm. I've trained my body to stay calm. And in that case, it's much easier to go, no, I don't think I'll eat that. Whereas if I'm sitting there stressed out by the pandemic and I can't believe how angry I am with the politics that's going on right now, and man, oh God. And I won't just stop at one Oreo. I might eat the whole darn bag because I'm trying to squelch that anxiety because the anxiety owns me. And I'm sure as a lot of you folks know, unfortunately, many of us are experiencing during this pandemic, anxiety is up dramatically. Depression is up dramatically. Alcohol abuse is up dramatically. I'm sure there's more domestic violence and all those kinds of things because our executive networks are overwhelmed with these demands coming from our desires and our motivation and our fear and our anger. Mindfulness and meditation, we're not going to go into the hows of this today, but I encourage you, particularly those of you who are skeptical about it, to do some exploring, to do some reading. Dennis, maybe one time you and I can do a session on mindfulness and go into deeper what it is, but it's a very powerful tool so that you still experience everything that you experience, but your executive network is much more in control of what you choose to respond to and what you choose to let go. And as we'll see in the next slide, one of my recommendations for you are some tools by a guy by the name of Dan Harris. Some of you may know Dan. I believe he's the morning anchor on Good Morning America on ABC. He's also the anchor for Nightline on ABC. Dan is one of the most skeptical, sarcastic, wise blank guys you're ever going to meet in your life. And he thought all this mindfulness and meditation was just what a bunch of gunk. And then Dan had a panic attack live on TV. And he barely got through the segment that he was in. He thought he was going to die. And he got out of that and he said, man, I got to figure out what's going on. Long story short, he started doing a whole lot of research. And in his role, he could go start interviewing a bunch of the top leaders in meditation and mindfulness. And he ended up writing a book called 10% Happier. It's funny, he went to a meditation retreat, which is hilarious how he described it in his book. All of his sarcastic comments and all of it, you're going to be able to relate to it if you're a skeptical kind of person. But when he came back, I think it was Diane Sawyer said, so what'd you get out of that? What'd you get out of that? Everybody's asking, what'd you get out of that? He goes, it made me 10% happier. That became his book that he wrote about it. Then he did another one called Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. And he has a wonderful app called 10% Happier as well. So we don't have time today to go into it, but that's a resource. That's a starting place. You can certainly Google it. You can reach out to me. I can give you all kinds of resources. I can talk to you about it more in depth. Okay.
And going back to the concept of investing, although again, I think from a book review viewpoint, depending on what you're dealing with, those folks that are watching, 10% Happier may be a better book for you to read than Your Money and Your Brain. But Your Money and Your Brain is one that we profiled before at Stearns Financial over the years. And Jason Zweig wrote this book with a ton of research information. One of the interesting stories, which sort of reminded me of your Oreo story, is he was at a university where they hooked him up to a whole bunch of things that were monitoring brain activity, and he was turning over cards, and those cards would either give him the ability to make money or lose money. And there was a deck on the right and a deck on the left, and the deck on the right, you would maybe gain a smaller amount of money or lose a smaller amount of money. The deck on the left, you gain a big amount of money, but you could lose a big amount of money. So he's turning over the cards one by one, and it's registering on all this equipment. He did not realize what was going on in his brain. So this is the whole thing we've been talking about here, is that we all say, oh, we're a civilized species and we know everything that's going on. A lot of times we have no clue. Now, sometimes we do have a clue, like when we're having a panic attack, that something bad's going on. But he had no clue that when he turned over the high risk card on the left, that it was actually shooting his system with all kinds of chemicals and other things going on, parts of his brain lighten up. And it was actually in the negative sense. And so they were not giving him this feedback real time, but something was going on inside. And you might say, Gary, it's that executive function was saying to him, you know, Jason, you ought to turn over more cards on the right, because that is consistent with where you are in your risk tolerance. And lo and behold, again, the researchers gave him no clues on this. He started turning over more and more cards on the right, and he didn't realize it at the time, but he was becoming calmer and calmer. He had kind of determined his real tolerance for risk. So let's go to the next slide.
Dennis, let me just jump in there for a second, because that's how I view folks in your profession. Like I said, we need to kind of give our executive network a little boost. And when it comes to, like, say, my finances, I know I can get that kind of rush that, oh, I want to go buy that stock because my pleasure center is firing. And then my brain will go, you probably shouldn't do that. I know. Let me call my friend Dennis. Let me call Paula. Let me call somebody who I trust that can help my executive network process this thing through and get me calmed down and help me make a better decision. So I think part of what you guys are in the job of doing is calming down that pleasure network that gets overfiring, because we know if it goes too far, we're going to experience the pain of losing all our money.
Yeah, so we do know that our clients, at least some of our clients, need to have that dopamine shot. And so that's part of the reason that we've been recommending core and explore portfolios. You know, set up a core, and again, it's the percentage varies for most people depending on their circumstances, but it could be 95%, it could be 70%. That is your core money, and do things that are more boring with it, and then do the explore. I mean, if you know, we're researching things from artificial intelligence to genomics to robotics to all kinds of other things. Doesn't have to be that exotic, but you know, if you want to do more things that'll probably have more dopamine involved, set up that explore account. And we even have a few clients who've set up a play account where they're playing with some of this stuff themselves, but it's with an amount of money that they know they can lose if unfortunately they misjudge some of the risks. And so that's essentially what Jason's saying right here. You know, you could sum up his whole book with put procedures in place in advance that help inhibit the hot reactions of the emotional brain. And from many conversations with clients these days, their brains are having hot reactions over almost everything, from the election debates to China to you name it. They're having hot reactions. So next slide, please. So here are some of the things in our written chat this weekend. We'll include some of these and even flesh them out a little bit more. But in the lower anxiety, avoid fumble idea area, number one, improve the altitude of your attitude. And we're going to get into that in the next couple of slides. Number two, get regular exercise. Okay, that's an easy one. But it turns out, back to Gary's original point, if you can do that, even if it's just taking a long walk or extending the walk, every other day, you're helping flush some of those things out of your system. You're helping center that executive function that Gary was talking about.
Let me add in there, Dennis, if I might, excuse me, but like on that one, you always want to make the right choice the easiest choice, because at the end of the day, we're all kind of lazy. So another part of kind of being human nature. And if I want to go exercise, well, I got to get up, I got to change my shit, and I got the remote control right here. Let me see what's on TV. So if you want to get regular exercise, make it easy for yourself. Hide the remote control if you need to. Sleep in the stuff you want to go exercise in the next morning. Have your shoes right by the side of your bed. I want to avoid the Oreos. Honey, next time you go to the store, please don't buy any more Oreos, because I have a hot response when you bring them home and I can't stop myself from eating them. Or when I do have them, hide them from me. So you want to plan in advance, but make those right choices the easiest choices.
So Gary, when you were eating that Oreo, when I ordered 2 boxes of it on Amazon, should I cancel that order?
3, please.
Oh, 3. Okay, I'll send a case your way.
Yep, Executive Network didn't kick in quick enough. Sorry.
Yeah. So number 3 is reframe the risk. And again, lessons from Fortune 500 CEOs and Navy SEAL. One of those reframe the risk pieces is that mindfulness and meditation piece, which again, one of my buddies who's a Navy SEAL and some of the Fortune 500 CEOs would say that probably ought to be number 1 on the hit parade for a lot of people. And then number 4, that old, boring, I don't know that there's any dopamine here other than us who love doing financial plans. Update your financial plan with post-COVID-19 scenarios. What could be more boring? Well, turns out we've been doing some of that for a number of our clients. And again, we do them for free for our existing clients. And those scenarios have in many cases helped lower their anxiety. It's like, oh, I had no idea that this, some of these things I was fearing wouldn't be as bad as it turns out they're not when we run that movie and look at that in our future scenarios.
That's interesting, Dennis. We actually kind of overplay when we imagine a negative scenario. We overplay how bad it's going to be. We still don't want to go through it, and we'll overplay how good something's going to be. So that's another way that our brains can kind of fool us. Now, one of the ways you can build in some dopamine to this is do something called counterfactual thinking. What if I don't update my plan and my plan's then behind the times and my portfolio crashes and I can't retire as early as I want? That's going to kick in my fear. It's going to kick in my motivation to protect myself. Let me call up my financial advisor now. So you can kind of use your mind to create some of those little jolts that you need to do what you want to do if the thought of it alone doesn't do it for you.
Oh, yeah, thanks for that one, Gary. And again, we're in the business of trying to make it as least painful as possible, but still, get the information we need to give our clients a realistic view of the future. So not always easy to do that. So let's finish this up with a key finding of Dweck's quest to understand how to avoid investing in life mistakes. And again, you've heard this before in different forms from us when we interviewed one of the top experts in the world on happiness, and we provided all that feedback. Doing and being are for most people better than having. Now, that doesn't mean that being poor is better than being well off or being financially independent. So within your financial independence framework, having is fine. But the fact is that doing and being is what gives people more lifelong satisfaction. And come to find out, in the pandemic, it's double or triple or quadruple what it is in a normal time. So let's talk about each of those in doing. So the doing examples Organizing a special occasion with family or friends. Well, I don't know how many times I've heard, well, I can't do that because of the darn pandemic, or, it just isn't the same being on Zoom. Um, but I've seen so many creative ideas. And so one of our clients who's trained in Zumba, a particular exercise workout, and so she schedules Zumba Zoom sessions with friends and some of the people for our firm, as a matter of fact. And what a great way to connect and also be able to get a little exercise while you're doing it. There was a great picture, which it just occurred to me, we probably should have run that little clip of people doing a Zumba class, and it was in a foreign country, and it was where they could all see each other out on their balconies. And there must have been, I don't know, dozens and dozens and dozens of people all doing it together, but not together. They were all out on the balconies doing things together. Number two, take a college course just for learning's sake. And the pandemic has certainly accelerated this area. If you haven't heard about Masterclass, they have some really cool, interesting sessions, and they're not old, dull, boring professors. All due respect to a few of our clients who are professors, who I'm sure make it very exciting in their classes for their youngins. These are people who sometimes celebrities who are on there doing a class in a particular topic and making it darned interesting. And Coursera is another one of those. And our clients have said we found it real enjoyable. And when we invite our friends to do it and then have a virtual wine tasting afterwards, we get even more enjoyment out of it. Now, I'm not sure where the virtual wine tasting is. That okay, Gary, in your Oreo example?
Well, if you read Jason's book, it really underscores the whole concept of everything in moderation.
Yeah.
Because if all you are is in your executive network, you're just going to be analytical all the time. You may be out of touch with your emotions. And he even says you don't make the best financial decisions if that's all you do, particularly if you ruminate over those numbers. There is something to be said for spontaneity. There's something to be said for your gut. But if you go too far in that area, you don't have any plan at all. You just do all kinds of crazy stuff. So yeah, a glass of wine or two, maybe after a rough day with friends to settle down, that's a nice way to kind of relax. You do 3 or 4, physically not good. It also it inhibits your executive network. So any part of you that says, I really ought to cut it out now, I ought to stop, you go, well, I'll just have one more. You might end up having 3 or 4 more. And that's how people start getting into trouble. So all things in moderation is a very wise way to go.
Great. And then finally, take up a new hobby. And again, we've heard a lot of people say, how am I going to take up a new hobby in the middle of a pandemic? Well, we've seen a lot of really interesting creativity in this area. One is, we have a client who does painting. He actually loves to paint, and he's doing it with his grandchildren who are in different states, and they have a time every week that they're set up to do it. Variations on this theme, we're seeing 100 different variations on that theme, and there's just a lot of things you can do that may be an existing hobby or something you always wanted to lean into. Some of those hobbies may have to wait post-pandemic, but the reality is many of them you can do now.
Dennis, let me share something really cool around that. I'm connected with a lot of people on LinkedIn, and I'm asking them when I meet them on LinkedIn, I say, hey, change creates opportunity, at least I believe. Has this change with the pandemic created any opportunity for you? Dennis, this one guy writes me back. He says, Gary, I was in 3 businesses before COVID hit. All 3 got wiped out. However, my hobby used to be art, and I'd kind of let that drop. Well, now I didn't have any of my businesses. I had a little bit more time for my art, and I rediscovered how much I loved it. And his motivation and the dopamine got reimagined around the art. And he said, here's how it ended up, Dennis. He goes, and Gary, I started a new business built around my art, and I've never been happier. Now stop and think about that. He started out with his entire livelihood wiped out. And because he was willing to take a little risk, not too much risk, he was willing to do some of the things you're talking about here, Dennis. He discovered a new passion, or actually renewed an old passion. And it's so powerful. I've never been happier. That's cool stuff.
That is cool stuff. And I remember many years ago, you actually provided a program on dealing with what appeared to be catastrophes at the time. And you told the story about Best Buy. So,
Mm-hmm.
and how that came out, that company was formed out of essentially, I think it was a tornado sale, right? Am I getting
Yep.
it?
Yeah, there was actually the same weather pattern. It went through Texas. It ended up going through Minnesota. Best Buy was in Minnesota. Their stores got wiped out by a tornado. They adapted by having a tornado sale. And the tornado sale was, we're gonna have to discount our stuff, and we'll just put it out where people can just pick it out themselves off the shelves. And the sale was so successful that they had it again the next year. They only had about 8 or 10 stores at the time. It was called Sound of Music. But when they had that first tornado sale, Dennis, they had a T-shirt on the back of their back that said, "Come on in and get your Best Buy." So over time, Richard Schultz, the owner, let's change our model to that. Best Buy last year was $42 billion business with about 1,000 stores. Same storm hit a little tiny store in Austin, Texas. It had just opened up a few months before. It flooded there, and the place was a mess. It was mud everywhere. Well, these guys had built relationships with the community, and the community came in to help them clean up. And people said, I'll fix your refrigeration. And I know you owe me some money. The vendors cut them a break. The name of that store, Dennis, this was the same day, same system. The name of that store, a little tiny store, is called Whole Foods. And the original Whole Foods was kind of wiped out by this flood, but because they had built solid relationships in their community with their customers and with their vendors, and everybody was willing to jump in and help get them back in business.
That is a remarkable coincidence. And this gets us to our last one, which is the being example. And so the being, which again, we've talked about in many of our newsletters when we interviewed the top expert on happiness, this was one of his top ones. Devote a portion of your time, energy, or treasure, usually some combination of 2 or 3 of those, to an idea, a cause, or a community you enjoy. Something that is beyond just yourself. And become a leader at your house of worship, virtually or otherwise. We actually have a client down in Georgia who is doing exactly that. And he's been a leader in his church, but when the pandemic hit, he has been leaning in, just doing remarkable things with the congregation as a lay leader, and helping out individual families, helping out families who been wiped out. And as we've chronicled on the uneven economic impact of the pandemic, some people are doing fine, doing things virtually from home. Other people who are in restaurants and leisure industry are suffering big time. And so he's been actually helping out individual families. It is giving him great satisfaction in the middle of a pretty difficult time. Volunteer at a soup kitchen. And yes, many of our clients are still doing this in the pandemic with, of course, appropriate personal protective gear. And then finally, reach out to elderly shut-ins. One client funded over 25 retirement community shut-ins as the pandemic worsened, and provided kits where they could make crafts that were then donated to impoverished kids. So not only did they feel like they were making a difference in these folks who had, in their terms, had been left out to pasture, and in a pandemic were really feeling isolated and lonely, they were giving some meaning to them. They gave some meaning to disadvantaged poor kids, and the amount of meaning back to our client, I just can't even describe. So again, just a few examples of the being that can also help with some of the anxiety, no matter how long this pandemic ends up lasting.
And let me just add in, if I might, some of you are sitting out there going, well, this all sounds good, but you're kind of overwhelmed. You're overwhelmed with anxiety. You're so depressed, it's hard to get off the couch. Or you're not that bad off, but it's just like, I don't know, I just don't have the energy for any of this stuff. One, if you are really hurting and you need to get some help, go get some help. It's okay to call a psychologist, counselor, psychiatrist, whatever you need to do. So go get some help if you need it. But number two, if you say, I don't think I really need that, but man, where's my motivation? One small step. Now, Dennis says exercise. I don't feel like exercising. Okay, get up, walk around the couch, and sit back down and watch your TV. You just took 10, 15 steps that you wouldn't have taken. And then maybe you'll go, well, that felt pretty good. I think tomorrow I'll go out and get the paper myself instead of sending the dog out to get it. And you'll find that gradually over time, volunteer, I don't know where to volunteer. Good, write Dennis after this. Dennis, you said volunteer activities. What kind of volunteer activities do you think I would enjoy? One small step to get the ball rolling is very, very helpful.
And I think very helpful to blood chemistry. So anything we can do, back to that 10% happier theme, just, make ourselves a little bit happier, however long the pandemic is going to last, is moving in the right direction.
It was interesting, Dennis, when Dan came up with it, he goes, I think I'm going to title my book 10% Happier. And the publisher and everybody else says, oh, who's going to buy a book 10% happier? I mean, that just, you got to make 100% happier, right? Well, that's where the skeptic comes in. He goes, no, that's not realistic. That's stupid. But hey, 10%, that would be pretty good. And so he wrote it. It became a New York Times bestseller. And Dan has become like almost a guru in this field. But he maintains his nice, skeptical, sarcastic self. He says, hey, try meditation. You're not going to go floating off into the ooze somewhere. It's just, so it's 10% happier. That's not a bad deal.
And I'd like to end this session by, first of all, thanking you, Gary, for another really interesting exploration into interesting times and interesting topics. And also saying that for all of our audience, our wish for you is that by the end of the pandemic, you're 10% happier. So thank you, Gary. Any last words, Gary?
Make the right choice, the easy choice. Yeah, here's my last word too. Self-compassion. You're not always going to make the right choice. Pandemic kicked in. I began to get nervous about a part of my portfolio that I managed on my own, a health savings account. And I said, man, I'm going to sell it all. I had a bunch of mutual funds, Dennis, so I sold them all. And I felt really good. Oh, that's great. And then sure enough, the market crashed right after that. And I'm going, man, I'm glad I listened to my gut that time. I also remembered from a previous experience. About 3 weeks later, I'm going, well, the market's really down. I think I'll buy back in. Well, you guys know what happened. Zoom. And it went down, next thing I know, I'm down another like $15,000. And I start getting, at least I sold it all again. And I began to beat myself up. I said, wait a minute, Gary. Right now it's hard because it's hard. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. It's a lot harder now for many of us. And I said, there's a whole technique for self-compassion, but basically you acknowledge, okay, I'm feeling really mad at myself right now. That's step one. Number two, you acknowledge your common humanity. Gary, I bet you're not the only one that has done that. I bet Dennis could tell you a lot of stories of people who did something similar like that. And hey, at least, and then you start, number three is you talk to yourself like you would a best friend. Gary, you're doing the best that you can. And hey, at least you sold it again the second time and you didn't put it back in. So good job with that. Be gentle with yourself, folks.
That is great advice. And as usual, this session is being taped and will be available on our normal YouTube channel. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for having me, Dennis. Bye-bye, everybody.